A Rat in the Wall, written by Sapphire Lion 15. Jessica vanished when I was 8. It's so weird when people disappear. One moment she was there, a part of my everyday life, and then she was just gone. She was 8 years older than me. She was the golden child in our family. Smart, beautiful, a gifted athlete, a loving girlfriend, and a prominent member in every club she joined. I wasn't as smart, gifted, or pretty as her, but my parents told me that I was full of potential. The night she disappeared was 3 days after my 8th birthday. It was storming outside, and I was messing around with the Lego set I'd gotten as a birthday present. Jessica got a call from... Actually, I don't know who called her, but whoever they were, and whatever they said, it made my sister's eyes go wide. She hung up the phone and announced that she was going out. She grabbed her favorite long red jacket and hurried out the door. I looked out the window as her car pulled out of the driveway and sped down the street. When she'd left, it was about 7:30. Going out with friends last minute wasn't unusual for her, especially on Friday nights, which it was. She was usually home by 9:30, which is why Mom started to get worried when 10 o'clock came and she still wasn't home. She called Jessica's cell. No answer. She called Jessica's boyfriend, Ryan. He picked up and asked if Jessica was mad at him. He hadn't heard from her all night. Mom was trying not to panic, but she was shaking like a maraca when she called my dad at work. The police were called. By that time, the next night, Jessica was listed as a missing person. There were search parties, there were news people, even sniffer dogs. Nothing was ever found. Mom fell apart. She started attending therapy, quit her job, and became extremely protective of me, obsessive almost. Dad refused to talk about Jessica at all. Mom seemed to be extra cautious around him, like he was a landmine set to detonate at any second. I honestly didn't know what to think. I didn't know if Jessica was dead or alive. I didn't know if I liked suddenly being the center of attention, and I certainly didn't like the change in Dad. Before Jessica disappeared, he'd been a pretty goofy, fun guy. He hadn't liked Ryan that much, but other than that, he and Jessica had been really close. A year passed. I was sort of isolated at school. The other kids avoided me. I couldn't say that I blamed them. How do you talk to a kid whose sister disappeared? Mom had started working again, but only part-time. Dad still refused to talk about Jessica. Actually, he refused to talk, period. Ryan sometimes checked in to see if there was anything he could do, but a stern look from Dad would send him on his way. On the 2nd anniversary of Jessica's disappearance, Dad made an announcement over dinner. We were moving. Within 4 months, we were in a new house 20 miles away from our old one. I could still attend my school, and Mom and Dad kept their jobs, so it didn't feel like much had changed. By that December, it was starting to feel like we could really go back to normal. Then I started hearing things. It was the night school had let out for winter break. I was lying in bed, contemplating the next 2 weeks of relative freedom, when I heard something behind me, or rather, in the wall behind me. It sounded like tapping. I wondered if it could be a rat. Our neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patel, had complained to my mother the other day about how her house had a terrible rat problem. How the houses in our neighborhood were built with massive spaces in between the outer and inner walls, and that it was all too easy for rats and other vermin to get in. Then I realized that there was a rhythm to the tapping. It almost sounded like a human drumming their fingers. I sat up in bed, clutching my stuffed elephant. There was a lamp on my nightstand, but I was terrified to move. I didn't want to do anything but sit still and hope that the thing making the noise would go away. I stared out my bedroom window, watching the falling snow and praying that the noise would stop. After a while, it did, and I fell asleep, hoping that I just imagined it. But when I came down for breakfast that morning, it became clear that I hadn't. Dad was venting about how the realtor had lied to him about our house not having a pest problem. He'd heard what must have been a humongous rat in the wall last night. He swore that right after work he was going out to buy traps. But none of us ended up leaving the house that day. The snow I had seen falling the night before had buried all of the nearby roads. Everyone was advised to stay home unless absolutely necessary. Until the roads were reopened, everyone was basically on lockdown. Dad ended up on the phone all day, talking to snowplowing companies, exterminators, the realtor, anyone. He was determined to stick to his plan of catching/killing the rat, but he wasn't having much luck. I stayed out of the way by taking an empty cardboard box left over from the move and sledding down a decent-sized snowdrift in the front yard. In the daylight, the idea of a rat in the wall didn't seem so scary, and I couldn't see why Dad was so upset. I learned why that night. The snow returned with a vengeance that night. The weather people said that we were in for one of the worst snowstorms in the history of our town, and that no one should even think about going outside. Mom made us all soup and hot chocolate, and tried to lighten the mood by asking me what I wanted for Christmas, and trying to play holiday carols on her phone. Her efforts were in vain. Dad refused to cheer up. It almost seemed like he was waiting for something. And whatever that something was, it scared him. At 7:30, the power went out. I'd been lying back on the couch, starting to drift off, and the lights going out woke me up. I looked for Mom. She'd gone up to bed. I looked at Dad. He just looked out the window. I noticed that his hands were shaking. We heard the bump an hour later. The rat, I thought. Then I listened closer. There was another thump, followed by a dragging noise. Then another thump, another drag. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking upstairs. If I was right, then they were headed for the staircase. "Taylor," Dad said to me, "whatever you do, don't turn around." The thumping, dragging thing had reached the top of the stairs. Then I heard a loud smack, followed by something large hitting multiple stairs as it rolled down. What or whoever this was, they'd just fallen down the stairs. I was about to turn around, but I sensed them standing up. I smelled something disgusting. No, disgusting isn't the right word. It was easily the worst thing I'd ever smelled. Still, I didn't turn around. "Daddy," it spoke. It had a terrible voice. It reminded me of crinkling old paper or buzzing insects. But there was something familiar about its voice. I knew it, somehow. "Daddy," it said again. "Why did you hurt me?" I looked at Dad. He was sobbing, but he hadn't turned around. "I didn't mean to. I meant to. I never wanted to. Oh, sweetie, You killed me." I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and gasped. The last 2 years had done a lot of damage to her. Her hair, except for a few strands here and there, was gone. A massive gash on her head exposed her brain. What remained of her organs could be seen through her visible ribs. Her eyes were still there, but the skin around them wasn't. Her clothes were streaked with spiderwebs, mud, and grime, but I still recognized her long red jacket. Jessica. She turned to me. She smiled, displaying a jaw of missing and rotting teeth. "Taylor," she said lovingly, "you've gotten so big." Her smile disappeared. "Do you want to know what happened to me that night?" Her gaze turned to Dad, who still hadn't turned around. He was blubbering like a baby. I wanted to know. "What happened to you?" "I got a phone call from a blocked number. It said, 'If you ever want to see your boyfriend again, tell him to go to the park.' They hung up. They'd garbled their voice. I didn't know who it was. I didn't call Ryan. I just went there myself. I thought it was just a prank. I wanted to tell them to knock it off. Then, as soon as I got there, I was attacked from behind by a bastard with an axe." She started to scream and pointed at the gash on her head. I stared in horror. I looked back at Dad. He was still crying. His shirt was sopping wet. I knew what she was going to say. I just couldn't believe it. "Daddy killed me." "No!" He still hadn't turned around and started screaming at the ceiling. "I thought it was Ryan. He was bad for you. I was helping you. I didn't want him to hold you back. I loved you. I thought I knew what was best for you. I never wanted to kill you." "Daddy, look at me." Finally, slowly, he turned his head towards her. He almost screamed, but jammed his hands over his mouth. Jessica stared at him and uttered 5 words. "You did this to me." Then she fell apart. In 30 seconds, she was a pile of bones and dust on the floor. For a moment, Dad and I simply stared at it. I wanted to cry, laugh, scream, and punch Dad all at once. He'd killed my sister. Before I had a chance to do any of these, though, I heard a pounding on the front door. I got off the couch, careful to avoid both my dad and the pile that used to be my sister, and opened the front door. 2 police officers decked out in coats and gloves asked to come in. I looked behind them and saw 2 snowmobiles topped with red and blue police lights. I nodded and let them in. My dad confessed. He admitted to the attempted murder of Ryan and the accidental murder of his own daughter, who he'd mistaken in the darkness for his target. He'd called in sick to work, taken the hatchet he used on firewood, and gone to wait in the park. Mom had believed that he was at work the whole time. His plan was, in his eyes, perfect. He just hadn't counted on Jessica showing up herself. He claimed that after he'd realized what he'd done, he'd sobbed for nearly an hour. Then, realizing what would happen to him if he was caught, he'd thrown her into his trunk, driven an hour away, and buried her under the house of a stranger in a neighborhood he'd never been in. He didn't realize until after we'd moved that he'd purchased the same house he'd buried his daughter under. Mom was shocked and horrified. Who wouldn't be? Dad pled guilty, so neither of us had to testify in court. He got life in prison. Mom applied for divorce. It went through the same day that Dad was officially locked up. I told the police that Dad had put the body in the living room after he had had a bit of a breakdown and ripped away the wallboards to reveal where he'd hidden it. If the cops noticed that my story resembled a famous Edgar Allan Poe story, then they didn't let on. Mom and I moved in with Grandma. We both go to therapy pretty regularly. She's more protective of me now than ever, but I can tolerate that. We're starting to get back to a state of normal. There's only one thing left that none of us can explain. When they were taking Dad away, one of the cops asked me who had called for help. When the call came in, the caller hadn't said anything. The dispatcher said that it had sounded like a high school girl, giggling. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope that these stories bring you a much-needed spooky distraction, and I hope you enjoy them. Have a good night, everyone. Love, the Mistress.